Hello, everyone. My name is Leo Goretti. I am the editor of the Trends and Perspectives in International Politics series, which is published by Routledge and edited by IAI, the Istituto Affari Internazionali based in Rome. Welcome to this webinar today, which is going to be about the European Union's non-proliferation policy, nuclear non-proliferation policy, with two very distinguished guests. Manuel Herrera, who is a senior policy fellow and program manager at BASIC, and who is also the author of the third book in the series, which is this one, the European Union's nuclear non-proliferation policy, which was just published as part of our series, and thanks to the Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo, is fully available in open access. My colleague Irene Rusconi, who is helping us with the organization of this webinar and to whom I'm thankful, will put a link to the book in the chat box so that you can have a look and download it or read it as you see fit. And Manuel will be in dialogue with Professor Clara Portela, who is a professor of political science at the University of Valencia, who has worked very widely about these topics, which seem to be especially timely right now. So as usual in these webinars, we will record the webinar. So feel free to kind of ask questions in the chat box. Just be aware that I will obviously mention who the person asking the question is. So if that's okay with you being recorded, then just do it. We will keep an eye on the chat box during the conversation between Manuel and Clara and try to kind of address and redirect any questions that you think may be relevant to our guests, to whom I'm really kind of thankful for being here. Just a few words about the book beforehand. We worked with Manuel on this book quite a while in 2024. The book discusses, as the title says, the EU's nuclear non-proliferation policy. It also has a very comprehensive historical kind of part, which was much more comprehensive in the first draft of the book. So it was basically a book in itself. So there is another book there for Manuel to be written about the history of the EU's nuclear non-proliferation policy, but still there is quite a lot in the book, also in the present version. And then there is a very kind of detailed analysis of the EU stance on these matters in the last 20 to 30 years, which are analyzed via two different kind of notions, the one of performance and the one of contestation. And there is also an analysis of how the EU's nuclear non-proliferation policy applied and was contested in two different kind of instances, which are the case of the Indian nuclear program and the case of the Iranian nuclear program. So this is basically the kind of structure of the book. Let's start with Manuel from like this more long-term sort of perspective, and I will ask this to you, Manuel, but obviously I would like also to hear what Clara thinks about this. So as I mentioned in your book, there is quite a lot about the history of the EU's nuclear non-proliferation policy, and you show in a very kind of comprehensive way how it changed over time, even though there are a number of issues which remained and still remain today relevant to it. So what has been the kind of the long-term trajectory of the EU's nuclear non-proliferation policy, and which are like the main kind of issues, the fundamental problems that have characterized it?
Many thanks, Leo, for the questions and for this comprehensive presentation. First of all, of course, I want to thank IAI, I want to thank Leo, and I want to thank Routledge for the opportunity to publish this book. It was quite an I would say, quite a trip, but finally the book is out. So I mean, first of all, of course, I want to thank all the team, because I mean, it says that I'm the author, but I think that it was a wider team work on this issue. So of course, very thankful for that, and of course, I want to thank Clara for being here today. I mean, because I know that she's connecting from a very different time zone, quite late in the night. So I mean, quite thankful to you as well for being here today. So asking your like answering your question, Leo. Let's say that the EU, the EU has never, or we can't consider the European Union as the same actor through time. Like the European Union did not exist, for instance, in the 1950s or 60s, 70s. Like, it was the European communities, and before that, we even had uh, specific programs from European states. So actually, what I try to do and address in the first part of the book, which is the most historical part, like the section devoted to the history and the evolution of the EU non-proliferation and disarmament policy, it's basically to go back to history to understand where all started before the European Union existed as such. And in this case, we can identify like three main phases, being the always, as I said, the longest one and the most the one that actually where actually most of the things happen being the last one. But let's say that we always start understand the build up of the European non-proliferation policy or the European non-proliferation design policy from the core or the belly of the beast, which are the member states. I mean, it's quite clear that without the member states and without the role of the member states of the first the European community and then the EU, the non-proliferation and disarmament policy of the European Union would be impossible today. And in this case, of course, there are two states that are vital to the European construction or to the European, let's say, um, so-called strategic vision about non-proliferation and about nuclear weapons, which, of course, are the United Kingdom and the French Republic or France. Uh, Particularly in the case when these two countries started to develop their own nuclear programs, and of course I'm being quite simple here, I mean I'm simplifying quite a lot, but there was of course an attempt by these two countries to have the separate or a European, let's say, defense or self-defense architecture, or in this case a self-deterrence that could rival, of course, the Russian, the Soviet side, but of course to be independent from the American side. Of course, we know that this at the end evolved in a different structure, specifically through structures inside the transatlantic alliance, like through NATO. But at the beginning, these two countries, and more specifically the British, aimed to have a self-preserve and independent deterrence capability to safeguard Europe, understanding Europe not so much as the European Union per se or the European community per se, but preserving the independence and security integrity of the European continent. And as a consequence, there was already here the let's say, a strategic embryo that has evolved till our days. We know, for instance, today, this same debate that was open in the 1950s, both by France and by the UK, about what should be the element that should preserve the European security vis-à-vis external actors, more importantly vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. Today we are seeing the same debate in current affairs with the proposal opened by the French in order to expand the French nuclear umbrella to the other European countries in order to face the threat from Russia. It's basically, we are to some extent repeating history through different variants, but I mean the issue is the same. And this comes, and of course, this has evolved through time to the current debate that we have now. But the other aspect, which is quite important and which is more related with the non-proliferation policy per se as such, was, of course, the creation of the European Atomic Community through then the creation of Euratom and the development of a specific Euratom-based safeguard system, which at the time was quite controversial. Today we assume it's quite normal because the Euratom safeguard system is fully embedded inside IAEA's safeguard system, and no one puts this into question. But that was already at the beginning at least for 10, 15 years, quite a controversial mechanism to guarantee non-proliferation on the European continent. Of course, the EU or the European community at the time learned a lot through its self inspection system, because that was the main problem with the Euratom's safeguard system at the time, which was a self-assessment and self-verification system without taking into consideration the IAEA. And as a consequence, but based on that experience, the European countries, the European states, developed quite a relevant knowledge in terms of, what were the elements that should be put in place in order to have a quite efficient and effective safeguard system. This problem, thank God, was solved through the famous Information Circular 193, signed between Euratom and the International Atomic Energy Agency, which established the cooperation or convergence mechanism between Euratom and the agency about how inspection should be taken place and under which authority. And thank God that problem was mainly solved. But it's quite important one, because people don't think about that the core basis of non-proliferation, of nuclear non-proliferation, are safeguards. Without a proper and verifiable safeguard system, proliferation would be quite widespread. So it's quite important to have that in place in order to have set the basis of how a non-proliferation or wider non-proliferation vision, particularly for the European Union, at the time European community, should be established. Because the European community, or the European Union now, had one key issue, which was the issue about having a common space for transactions, a common space for trading without specific borders or barriers inside the European continent. And that, of course, puts in place a whole lot of issues that had to be developed afterwards by the European countries in order to guarantee that nuclear technologies and material, or dual-use technologies and material, were not diverted to, to malicious parties or parties who wanted to proliferate. So I would say that the third part of the historical development of the European non-proliferation and disarmament policy, which we all mostly date back in the 1980s, was basically to establish all the mechanisms to guarantee the proper safe control of the transfer of goods and service of specific dual-use goods through the European continent and outside the European continent. And this was made in parallel with the creation of a very well-structured European institutional framework. First, of course, we started with a working group inside the EPC, the European Political Cooperation. Then, of course, this working group on non-proliferation and disarmament developed specific guidelines about how member states should develop and implement non-proliferation policy according to, a common and shared framework. And of course, let's say a specific legislative instruments that were created during the 1990s, such as the common actions, help to, standardize all this. Actually, from a legislative point of view, from a legislation point of view, the core acquis of non-proliferation and disarmament in Europe was created in the 1990s, thanks to the first directive and the first common positions in terms of export controls that were made, export controls of dual-use technologies and materials that were made wide through a specific common legislative instruments. So that was already, that was the big core development of the European non-proliferation policy. And of course, once that we have the core values, the core ideas about how European non-proliferation policy should be framed or should be understood in terms of safeguards, in terms of export controls, mostly in terms of those two, because that's those are like the two main things where the European Union has been working on in terms of non-proliferation and disarmament. Of course, the European Union has its own means and ways of implementing nuclear diplomacy through in specific fora, such as the NPT REFCONs. But in any case, once that all those bases were settled through decades, it was the time, like the key, like it was the time to publish the key document for the European non-proliferation disarmament policy, which was basically the 2003 strategy, which still we use today in order to understand and in order to state what the European non-proliferation policy should look like or aims to look like. Now, the strategies are quite comprehensive one. It's also quite a short one, like tries to address all the main issues and concerns in terms of non-proliferation disarmament risks in a very concise and short document. Like I think it's maximum 13, 15 pages, if I'm not wrong at the time. But has been, since then, this has been the guiding document for the implementation of a common non-proliferation policy by the European Union, which at the same time, some aspects, everything must be said, some aspects have been supranationalized and others still remain on the hands of member states, which still it's quite an inefficient mechanism or inefficient way to implement policy because, there's always tensions, contradictions between, EU level policy, national level policy, and we can see these tensions every single day when the non-proliferation policy is to be implemented. But in any case, now we have a single document that reflects how policy should be implemented and how policy should be uh, adopted. In any case, further beyond that, the most important development took place after the Lisbon Treaty, with, of course, the separation of some competences in terms of what the Commission should be in charge for, and then what the European External Action Service should be in charge, because at the time the European External Action Service did not exist. After the Lisbon Treaty, the EAS was created, and of course many of the topics that were inside the agenda of the Commission or the agenda of the Council came to the European External Action Service as the coordinator of all the elements. Today, from an institutional point of view, the working group from the EPC that I mentioned at the beginning has transformed into the CONOP basically, and which actually we have inside it's inside a two-tier structure. We have the CONOP for non-proliferation disarmament. We have COARM for conventional weapons and export controls. So we have those two specific working groups inside the council that deal with this specific agenda. And then, of course, we have all the elements or all the policies from the Commission that can affect directly or indirectly to non-proliferation policy, because as we know, non-proliferation, it's not a single tier policy, but it's a quite transversal policy that goes from different issues, agendas, can go from environmental policy to health, to trade, to public diplomacy, of course. So it's a type of policy that affects different agendas, affects different direction generals inside the Commission, and as a consequence, there needs to be coordination between the working groups in the Council and the different direction generals. And of course, the EAS, it's one of the responsibles to foster this coordination. So now, more or less, we always say now that the non-proliferation policy, it's finally centralized in a single body to some extent. But in any case, as I said, still, there are still quite a lot of tensions between EU member states and the European institutions in terms of how to implement policy, and of course not so much in terms of how to implement specific non-proliferation policy, but how to implement some aspects of non-proliferation that derive from the tensions between and the conflicts between the different EU member states. So we have a multi-tier policy, transversal policy with many actors, with not with a with a different tier of actors in terms of EU actors, national state actors to be involved, but still we can say that from the early 50s till now, some developments have happened in terms of non-proliferation policy, and at least we can say now quite confidently, although of course this can be open to discussion, that the European Union has a well-structured, both institutionally and policy-wise, non-proliferation policy.
Thanks, Manuel, for this overview, and I'd like also to hear from Clara what she thinks about this kind of overarching narrative that Manuel has kind of offered about the evolution of the EU's non-proliferation policy, and especially in terms of its kind of long-standing features and kind of fundamental traits that Manuel tried to outline.
Well, thank you very much. Basically, my first question to Manuel actually has to do with this evolution, because the way in which you have constructed this narrative, it looks like the evolution was pretty incremental and linear. So step by step, things were improving. But at the same time, I was wondering, I'm not quite sure that the evolution can be described as being linear and incremental and stable, so to say, in its development. So I was wondering, if we take the establishment of the common foreign and security policy as the starting point of non-proliferation, of EU non-proliferation policy, which obviously is not quite accurate because it did start earlier. But let's say that the institutional framework, the budget, the structures were there since the establishment of the CFSP. So for you, what would be the, let's say, the main turning point? Where would you locate the main turning points? And where perhaps would you locate the backlashes or the missed opportunities, the moments in which non-proliferation policy could have made a leap and become something much more prominent in the framework of EU foreign policy and still didn't happen?
Okay, so no, actually, I mean, I must agree with Clara on one point, because my description was, of course, like very, was purely incremental, was in terms of like everything here was wonderful and everything just went according to the plan, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and for people who have been studying EU politics, we know that that doesn't happen like that. So I would say but I would certainly not say that we have one single turning point that said like, okay, we need to like made all member states like, okay, we need to agree on this. We need just to put our things together and just develop this thing and implement it in an efficient way. I don't think that there was a single conditional event. Of course, if I have to choose one, I would say like the most critical one was the Gulf War, and I would say like the Gulf War and when it was discovered that Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq was developing nuclear weapons and or a nuclear weapons program, and that most of the providers of the technology were European in nature. I mean, I think that the red alarm, the red light, the red alarm just started to go all around Europe in terms of not so much how to develop an efficient and an effective non-proliferation policy, but I mean, and this is the key issue that has conditioned a lot the vision of the European Union and the tensions at the European Union is how to establish an efficient export control system for dual-use technologies and materials. Because, let's say Iraq is just or was just the fact or the, let's say, was just the evidence that the export control system in EU in the EC was not efficient. I mean, but we have Iraq, we have then Libya, of course, we had Pakistan for sure. There were many cases, but I mean, the case of Iraq was more was like we always put it like the clear, and as a consequence, European states just agreed that they had to develop a common and efficient export control system for dual use technologies and materials. And I think that that's the core basis then for the further institutional development in the context of the CFSP, and specifically for the adoption of a specific legislation in terms of specific legal instruments in order to do that. So if I have to take one episode, I would say that's the episode. I would just as the turning point. Of course, I think that there are others. I think that the agreement between Euratom and the IAEA was quite a successful one in any case, and a positive one, not as the case of Iraq, which was quite an embarrassing one for many European countries. Now, what the European Union, which are the missed opportunities of the European Union? I must agree that the European Union has missed a lot of opportunities in order to be, particularly in terms of public diplomacy. and specifically public diplomacy in non-proliferation and disarmament fora. Let's going to be clear. The European Union has not been an efficient and actor in the context of the NPT REFCON. This is like that. We have had our own limitations as an actor. The European Union has had its own limitations as an actor. But again, and here I go to the term I used at the beginning, has had its own limitations as an actor because of the belly of the beast, which are the member states. Clara, as I know, when we read the Council conclusions for each PrepCom and for each REFCON, we can see the language, and we can see that this language is not ambitious enough in order to tackle specific problems and concerns that are raised by other countries or by other states in the context of the REFCON. We know that it's quite business as usual. We try to put forward something that fits according to the spirit of the REFCON and according to our non-proliferation and disarmament strategy, and let's see what happens. I think that has been the approach of the European Union for the last 20 years, at least, with the REFCONs. So I think that has been one of the main misfortunes and one of the main missed opportunities of the European Union, particularly in terms of advancing in the implementation of Article 4 and Article 6. I think that has been clear. But again, this happens because member states don't agree on how Article 4 and Article 6 needs to be implemented. And as a consequence, as member states don't agree, and as they are incapable of adopting more ambitious and wider positions, nothing can be done, or things that can be done are quite limited in nature. So that would be one of my concerns, or one of the main lost opportunities vis-a-vis EU non-proliferation and disarmament policy.
Thank you. So I take the opportunity to ask a question concerning the strategy, the EU strategy for non-proliferation. This was adopted shortly after the Gulf War, so in 2003. And the thing is that this is more than 20 years ago. So my question is, the fact that we have never seen a new, an update of the strategy, an updated strategy, despite the fact that the geopolitical context has been evolving a lot. It basically is evolving as we speak. How come this has not been updated or renegotiated? Is it, should we interpret this as meaning that the consensus among the member states already reached its peak in 2003, and we really cannot go beyond what was reflected in the 2003 strategy? Or are we rather witnessing a situation in which there has been a de-emphasis of non-proliferation policy? Like there was a lot of enthusiasm behind the initiative tabled by Sweden back at the time, but nowadays people are more worried about about violent conflict, about energy security, about about the Gaza contingencies and so on, about China perhaps, and nobody's really paying that much attention to EU non-proliferation policy, or how else can we interpret the fact that we have a strategy that is perhaps a bit outdated already?
So fully agree on that. The strategy is outdated. I don't have any further comments on that. It's a fact. The strategy, and even if you read the language of the strategy, it's a different world. We don't live in that world anymore. I would not agree so much that it's the peak of of agreement between or consensus among states, EU states, because yes, can be understood in that way, but also we must understand in the context in which the strategy was drafted. As you pointed out, was shortly after the Gulf War. Again, this was the turning point, the Gulf War, and what happened with the Iraqi nuclear program. And of course, the strategy drinks a lot from that episode and tries to, establish a specific set mechanisms to address that in the future. But I would say that the strategy, what aims more than deal with the cases such as Iraq in 1991, what aimed is to deal with cases as the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States, in the sense that the strategy clearly aims to portray itself like, oh, there is we have an alternative recipe in order to address proliferation crisis. It's not going to be through military force. It's going to be through multilateral mechanisms, diplomacy, and negotiation. And let's say that this strategy, to some extent, worked for some years, because this strategy was clearly implemented in the context of the Iranian nuclear program. If you see how the European Union act in the context of Iran, they just followed the strategy point by point, letter by letter, just in order to try to reach an agreement with the Iranians in terms of, how to control or their nuclear program, or TM, that they don't proliferate. Of course, we know that in the case of Iran, particularly in the last phase of the when Rouhani reached power, was elected president, there wasn't a specific involvement of the United States, and most of the negotiations were done at the end bilaterally between the US and the Iranian leadership. But the basis on how to reach that point was basically the EU non-proliferation strategy. Now, what has been the problem? I mean, I don't think it's an issue that we don't want to update it. I think it's an issue that after US withdrawal from the strategy in 2018, that was like a public acknowledgement by one of the big powers, in this case the United States, that this way of proceeding is not useful. It's not useful, or it's not acceptable, or it's not forced, or it's not seen by the big players in this specific regime as a legitimate way in order to address non-proliferation issues. And then, of course, the US administration went forward with the maximum pressure strategy and so on. So I think that after that, once that your, let's say, core policy foundation just is destroyed like that publicly by the United States and by a big power, like a big player in the regime such as the United States, you just don't want to address that issue anymore. You just say like, okay, let's just gonna skip this. This is a fair attempt that we tried, and let's just gonna try to focus on something else. And I think that has been quite clear, coming back to the case of Iran, on the approach that the European Union has had to the Iranian dossier after 2018. If you see, particularly during the period when Josep Borrell was High Representative of the European Union for the Common Foreign and Security Policy, most of the attempts to reach an agreement on the Iranian dossier, on the Iranian nuclear file, had to be previously discussed with the United States. I mean, there was not aim, or like there was no proper self-alone initiative as the European Union had in 2003 and 2004 and 2005 with Iran. This did not happen again. So I think that from a conceptual point of view, when the Europeans, the EU and the Europeans just see that their main policy document, their main policy directive is just scrapped like that, they just don't want to address the issue anymore, and they are maybe just waiting to retake these things in the future when a crisis happens, because that's important. CFSP always changes or adapts itself whenever there is a crisis, and that's how it works. That's what the history of the European construction shows us. Basically, we just work based on, we don't prevent crisis, we just see a crisis and we just try to adapt. So whenever we have a crisis similar to Iraq, for instance, we will just adapt ourselves to the situation, probably. And then a second point on what you mentioned, I mean, I think that there isn't also not an aim, let's say, to redraft the strategy. I just mentioned, like, it's a total conceptual backlash against the European position vis-a-vis this domain, this regime, etc. But also it's the fact that it's, again, as you pointed out, we have consensus speak. Like, EU member states, I think at this point, are not in a position particularly now with the great issue that the French have opened into the public debate. I don't think that European states, EU states, are in a position to agree on a renewal or in a redraft of the non-proliferation strategy.
Okay, so I also have another question that I'm not sure that this is quite reflected in the book, but precisely because of that, I would like to raise this issue. So we have traditionally had a number of countries that have been at the forefront of promoting disarmament rather than non-proliferation. Actually, non-proliferation turned out to be the topic that was consensual. It was what everybody was to achieve. But largely, some of the drivers of this proliferation policy and of a unified approach were precisely a number of member states which were not inside NATO. They were not members of NATO, but they were not among the most active pro-disarmament advocates. I'm talking about Finland and particularly Sweden, countries that have been endeavoring to frame a middle of the ground, so to say, or intermediate position that was able to attract the support of both NATO members and the most active disarmament advocates. So now that these most moderate the pro-disarmament countries have joined NATO, how is this going to affect the non-proliferation policy of the EU? So does it seem to you it's going to become more conservative? Is it going to become more fragmented? Or is this actually going to be beneficial in a way? So are we going to see more activity, less activity, and in which direction is it going to go? What's your take on this?
That's a little bit like the crystal ball. No, but in any case, no. I mean, it's true. I mean, and that's what I was mentioning before. When I was talking about the role of the EU in the context of the REFCON, for instance, and the lack of consensus in the outcome in the Council conclusions, to advance in Article 6 is because this kind of divide that we have inside the EU member states for those who are pro-disarmament, against disarmament. This is still a CFSP domain, so everything needs to be taken in by consensus in the Council for the time being, unless we have a modification of the treaties, which I don't see that happening anytime soon. So all member states will have to adopt positions based on consensus. What might happen, particularly now that Sweden and Finland have joined the NATO side inside the European Union, or the NATO group inside the European Union, is that, of course, Ireland, Austria, and Malta will be more alone in the Council in trying to defend the implementation of Article 6 and the most abolitionist perspectives vis-a-vis nuclear weapons. The Stockholm Initiative developed by Sweden will just be paused, or maybe Spain will take the initiative of the Stockholm Initiative. We don't know yet. But still, the Stockholm Initiative was an aim to try to bring together pro-disarmament, non-proliferation, arms controllers, etc., among the different EU member states. But for the time being, the Stockholm Initiative, I think it's going to be paralyzed, and this kind of bridge builder role that Sweden aimed to have between all the groups will just disappear. And what we will see, it's maybe even Council conclusions that are even less ambitious than what we have right now in terms of, the NPT REFCONs, the IEA maybe, or the CTBTO, sorry. That will be even less ambitious because, for instance, we are already having again the debate about nuclear testing, and that nuclear powers will have to test their new weapons just not only because to know what their new weapons do, but also in terms of nuclear signaling. So CTBTO and CTBT might be also at risk there, and it's highly probable that the EU will just adopt less ambitious positions vis-a-vis in favor of the CTBTO. I mean, this is a hypothesis, but I mean, this is what I might think. So yeah, probably what we will see is less ambitious, less clear, more vague council decisions than what we are seeing right now.
So I see that there are a number of external participants who are interested in asking questions. So I'm just going to finish with a short question to you. So the book analyzes non-proliferation policy of the EU along two dimensions. One of them is performance, and I think that you have already said a number of things concerning how you evaluate the performance. But what about contestation, the second dimension? Is there a contestation of the who is articulating it? What can you tell us about that?
I'm sorry, Clara. Can you repeat the question because you were cut off during the, when you were asking?
Okay. So I'm going. Perhaps this is an incentive for me to ask the question in a more targeted fashion. So, who is contesting non-proliferation policy, and why?
So we can see, I mean, the way I analyze in the book, it's like we have two levels of contestation. We can have contestation at multilateral level and contestation at bilateral levels. In the case of bilaterals, I analyze the two cases of India and Iran, and of course, in those cases would be Iran, India, but even more complexly, in a more complex way, in the case of Iran, we can even have the United States. I mean, the fact that the United States was not supportive of the European approach towards Iran at the beginning, 2003, 2004, that's a way of contesting the European role. And then, of course, when the when the Americans just decided to get out from the ECPOA, which was basically an agreement, technically speaking, mostly negotiated and put forward by the European Union, that's also a way of contesting EU non-proliferation policy in the context of Iran. In the context of India, I just explained basically that India, it's a country that has been contesting the European Union for many decades, particularly in the context of the different, like in terms of supporting the NPT, particularly because the European countries are big supporters of the NPT, big supporters of the CTBT, have been trying to promote the inclusion of India in this fora. And of course, India has been one of the main countries that has criticized both the CTBT and the NPT. And as a consequence, what we have seen through time is that the European Union's approach vis-a-vis India has been quite accommodative, particularly after the civil nuclear agreement between the US and India. The European Union, in the context of, particularly in the context of the nuclear suppliers group and export controls, has tried to accommodate India as best as possible. And at the end, what we have seen with India through time, of course, this is further developed in the book, is that the Indian position vis-a-vis the EU non-proliferation policy has changed because the conditionality aspects of EU's policy vis-a-vis India have been withdrawn. Basically, the European Union has accommodated India's role as a nuclear power recognized de facto outside the NPT framework, and as everyone wants to, have exchanges between Europe and India, and as India is a quite relevant actor in the context of nuclear weapons and in the context of the non-proliferation regime, even if it's not part of the NPT. The European approach has been basically to accommodate India's position, try to reach agreements in terms of peaceful uses of nuclear energy and in terms of nuclear transfers and assistance. And that's it. And that's one of the things that is quite interesting in the chapter of India, is how India's position has changed vis-a-vis the European Union through time, in terms of, first criticizing the European aims to force India to get inside the NPT. For instance, that has been one of the main critiques of the Indians. And now most of the discussions between the EU and India don't go around nuclear issues, unless we are dealing with nuclear trade. In multilateral context, what we see is that a general critique, not so much a critique from a specific actor, but for instance, a general critique by a set of actors that can be both states and non-state actors in the context of specific diplomatic initiatives. What the clear example would be the NPT REFCON, and how the European Union's conclusions through time, the European Union's conclusions vis-a-vis the PrepCon, the REFCON, and so on, are more ambiguous or more vague, and how this has set a position for some actors in the context of the REFCON that the European Union is just a champion of the NPT, is just a status quo actor that wants things to go forward as they are, business as usual, and that's it. As a consequence, the position of the European Union has been contested in terms of, on whether the European Union is either a relevant actor in the context of the NPT REFCON, or whether the European Union should be even an actor in the context of the NPT REFCON, which this opens another debate at all, because, the REFCON, the NPT, is a treaty for state parties. What does the European Union do there? That would be one of the main critiques and one of the main contestation points as well. Then, of course, we have, in terms of, export controls, and particularly the role of the European states in the context of the NSG, because, the European Commission, it's present in the NSG but can't vote. So it's basically an observer. And the fact that EU member states have not been able to coordinate their positions in the context of the group, in terms of, promoting access to peaceful uses of nuclear technology, and the proper transfer of nuclear technologies and nuclear materials for third countries. And this has been one of the main critiques to the European countries. Also, the fact that, the way the NSG works, the nuclear suppliers group work, that has always been characterized, or has been called, as a cartel between states, and that the European Union has not tried to do anything in order to change the cartel structure, has also been an issue and a matter of contestation by specifically third world or so-called global south countries. We can have cases such as Brazil, such as Angola, Mozambique, in Africa, Niger, Arab countries, and so on. We can see many examples, but in any case, those are the reasons why they are. In terms of peaceful uses and transfers, I think I reached myself a conclusion in that chapter quite similar to one that you reached yourself some time ago. But I think that you also reached this conclusion some time ago, which is the fact that we can't properly find contestation on nuclear transfers, and sorry, not on nuclear transfer, on peaceful cooperation and assistance, and peaceful nuclear assistance, because there are and this is one of the challenges of that chapter, and one of the challenges I found through the research is, like, the European Union has so many cooperation and so many assistance programs all around the world, that it's quite difficult to find links between themselves and find causation between the different variables. So that was one of the most challenging chapters to deal with, and one in which I could not find specific contestation to the EU. So that would be the only area where the EU is not contested, at least not in a public way. But yeah, those would be my takes on contestation.
Thank you very much, Manuel. I think that perhaps it's time for me to give the floor back to Leo in order to discuss the questions by the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you. Yes, we do have a number of questions, I think, for both our panelists. 3 questions focus on the scenario in which we are living in now. So, and this was also something I was thinking about while Manuel was talking, whether the Ukraine war may be seen as a sort of critical juncture in the history of nuclear non-proliferation in Europe. The 3 questions are Giovanni Brauzzi, I'm sorry if I mispronounced it, asks about what would happen to European nuclear deterrence if Trump is withdrawing US DCAs from European bases. And in a similar vein, Chiara Cervasio asks about defense beyond European defense beyond non-proliferation issues. So how do you see the current calls to create a new European defense community or unified force? What would that look in practice? Would that be feasible and so on? And finally, Plamen Pantev asks about whether the EU is ready to tolerate nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear proliferation, in Europe, in the present geopolitical situation of Russian aggression against Ukraine and the Western democracies. And then we have a very kind of comprehensive comment by Dvi Ramatsaputra about nuclear licensing, which is directed to Manuel, and we don't have time to read it all, but I will leave it up for you for your considerations anyways. I would start then with Manuel and then Clara, and then we are approaching 6 p.m. In Rome, so we will then call it a webinar. Over to you, Manuel.
No, many thanks. And of course, first of all, I'm very happy to see that both friends and colleagues, Plamen and Chiara, are here today. So, I hope that you're enjoying the event. So the questions are quite, I knew that this was going to be discussed today because, this whole debate raised by France, it's quite timely for sure. But one question that we should ask ourselves, I think it's particularly in the case or in the context of Plantem's question, is whether the EU can actually have capabilities and legal status to perform any activities on these areas, which my reply would be no. And actually, most of the debates that the French have raised recently about the potential expansion of the French nuclear umbrella has been done on an interstate basis, so basically in an intergovernmental scenario and setting, because there is no aim, and this has been quite clear the message has come quite clear from Paris, at least as the French nuclear doctrine sets right now. The French nuclear program, it's only for national defense, although they are reframing this to some extent, whether European defense and European security is also national defense for the French. But most importantly, the only person responsible for the use of the French nuclear weapon is the President of the Republic, and only under the authority of the President of the Republic, this decision will be based on. No one else. So that already sets the idea about who is going to have the ultimate responsibility. It's not going to be President Ursula von der Leyen, or it's not going to be the President of the EU Council, Antonio Costa. It's going to be the President of the French Republic. So this already limits quite a lot the role that the European Union can have on these matters, on these purely strategic matters. But this goes to the core of the developments of nuclear programs in the on European soil. Like the British and the French at the time were thinking like deterrence, a nuclear deterrence capability provides independence to the European continent. The question is how should be framed and how should be structured, and whether it should be done through a multinational or in this case European EU-based umbrella structured, or should be done through a classical intergovernmental alliance and agreement. And I think that the things are going through that path in any way. And actually the European Union and this is the basic understanding that we have about what future for the French and at the time British nuclear weapons. If the European Union decided to become nuclear, the main understanding that we have from the 1990 NPT REVCON and also from the European Court of Justice was that this could be allowed only if the European Union became a macrostate with an inherent nuclear capability from France and the United Kingdom. This is not going to happen anytime soon. However, as I said before, the European Union learns and does things when we are in times of crisis, and for sure, I think that to some extent, I think that the council president, like Antonio Costa, is going to try to put forward the strategic debate inside council discussions, in order to see whether, not so much in terms of nuclear capabilities as such, but as Chiara was pointing out, defense capabilities beyond nuclear. I think that that's where the Commissioner for Defense and where the EU Council President have a say in terms of, having a proper interoperable, the proper interoperability between EU armies and EU armed forces that can be conducted through a common planning and capability group at the EU level. This can be a discussion that member states can have at the Council right now, not so much on the nuclear issue, but in terms of specific conventional capabilities vis-a-vis the, let's say, supranationalization. I don't want to say supranationalization because it will not be that case, but will be the interoperability of EU armed forces under a common EU hat. This can be discussed right now. But on the nuclear debate, I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon, particularly as the French have been framing the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Manuel. And Clara, do you want to comment or add something to that?
Well, thank you very much. I believe we only have a couple of minutes, so I'm going to try to be brief. It seems to me that the withdrawal from European bases that actually belong to the US, I don't think that this possibility is actually going to have much of an impact, because the operational value of these weapons was already very low. They have become quite outdated. So even in case of a battlefield situation, it would be very unusual. It would be very unlikely that these weapons would be used at all. The delivery means are also quite outdated. So the reason why these weapons were being kept where they are were more symbolic than anything else. So withdrawing them is something that doesn't really change a big deal, particularly because if the willingness of the US to activate these weapons was not going to be there anyhow, then it would actually be more efficient to just get rid of them altogether. Now, as far as the development of a European deterrent is concerned, well, certainly one of the key questions is what Manuel has been describing. The fact that this could become a European deterrent in the sense that the protection could be extended to everyone in the EU. But ultimately, the decision-making on use would not be shared. It would remain a decision exclusively by France, so that more than a European deterrent, we would have a French deterrent with the entire European Union as a protection area. And we also have to be careful with this notion of protection, of extended deterrence, because on the one hand, there is the possibility that you can be more secure because you have this nuclear guarantee. Actually, we already have a nuclear guarantee from the US, even though this is weakening by the minute. But at the same time, it can also make you a target. It can make you a more legitimate target, precisely because you are protected by nuclear weapons. Even if you're not a nuclear power, you are nuclear armed in a way. So let's say that there is a tacit or an implicit agreement that it will be more legitimate for a nuclear power to attack another nuclear power than for a nuclear power to attack a non-nuclear armed power. And we would actually be losing that legitimacy or that status of being completely nuclear free. So from that point of view, if we lose the status of being part of the countries protected by the US nuclear umbrella, perhaps we are not going, well, perhaps we shouldn't be rushing to replace that umbrella, especially if we are especially because we are talking about an ombrellino. We are not talking about a big umbrella. We are talking about rather modest nuclear deterrents. So there is a case to be made that actually without any nuclear protection whatsoever, we might be more secure. So we also have to take this into account. So thank you very much, and back to Leo.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Clara. Thank you for taking time also. I know it's quite late at your end. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Manuel, of course, for the book, which everyone can download from the chat or from Guy's website. And just conclude, we will have another webinar, which is going to be about the upcoming special issue of the International Spectator, which is just about to be published on populist radical right governments in Europe, which will be held on the 8th of May. So if you are interested in that, just check the IAIS website for the announcement. Thank you very much, really, and have a good evening or good night, everyone. Thank you.